on a personal level, what are your own reflections?
Like, it is very interesting. Like, this is just a weird comment. It's very interesting to think that, like, we're the top species on this planet, right? We have been forever. Turns out there's another one. Turns out there's a number two we've kind of forgotten about. Viruses are probably number two, right? Like, we don't worry about lions and tigers, and we don't worry about most things. Turns out viruses are the other species that are, they ain't number one, but they can disrupt our lives pretty good. And then maybe mosquitoes might be number three, but turns out viruses are pretty formidable. They're the only challenger to the human race on this planet are viruses. So that's kind of weird. The thing I actually think about a bit is sort of personal finances. Because Americans in particular I think they're very irresponsible with finance in terms of they have way too much debt. American families have a ridiculous amount of personal debt, credit card debt, car loans, all of that.
So that will kill them.
So many of them don't have enough cash to go 6 weeks without a paycheck. And Americans didn't used to be that way. If you went back to the 1960s, Americans were not this way. They were not debtors. They were like frugal, and they saved, and they didn't borrow money. So I'm thinking hopefully that's a good thing that's going to come out of this. Like, if all the Americans just cut up their credit cards, that would be a good result of this whole thing. Put more money in the bank, cut up your credit cards. Be ready for life. I think Chinese are not nearly as bad as Americans are. The average American family has a ridiculous amount of credit card debt.
You were just commenting about the optimism of Chinese consumer. How much they love spending money.
That's true. But if you actually look at like personal debt levels of China, not government debt, which is actually pretty big, family debt, it's actually pretty low. And there's a lot of saving going on. Not as much as there used to be, but still quite a bit. But Americans have just been, I think, really reckless financially. The problem with all this, if you have a lot of debt and you don't have a lot of cash in the bank, it just assumes nothing is going to go wrong. And then something goes wrong, like you can't work for 3 weeks or a month, and everything becomes a crisis. So I'm hoping that will be like a thing, like a bunch of Americans would just cut up their credit cards and get rid of debt and be a little more conservative in that. I mean, if you think about, like, if the US is the wealthiest country in the world on a per capita basis, mostly at that scale, there's smaller countries, but for 300 million people, the fact that so many of them you don't have 6 months worth of cash in the bank. I mean, how can such a wealthy country like have people who don't have 6 months of cash in the bank? Like that's really kind of, that's a behavior issue. I don't think it's, there's tough times. Anyone can have 6 months of cash in the bank. So I think that's just a personal behavior thing. I'm hoping that goes away. But
well, it's a very expensive country to live in, isn't it?
Yes and no. I mean, it's cheaper than Europe. A lot, food is cheaper than Europe. Internet is cheaper than Europe. A lot of stuff is much cheaper than Europe, relative to income. So healthcare is very expensive in the US, but a lot of things are cheaper than other developed countries.